Hey, what's up guys, it's Oakley, and CA put out a video where they're going to be discussing kind of some Q&A. So part of it deals with Total War Warhammer 2. Most of the stuff has been addressed previously, so we're going to skip over this. The more interesting part takes place in the second half, where they bring on Darren and he discusses the next historical title. So he has a couple key things to say. The first he says is the historical title is, being pushed ahead by a team that works in parallel to the Warhammer team. They're not at all sidelined by the Warhammer work. It's a complete separate team that works in parallel, and he confirms that they're in full production. That's something we knew. But then an interesting little thing that he says is a lot of people were disappointed where Warhammer 2 was announced, and people were like, oh god, this means the historical title is going to be years away. And he said, hold on, it'll actually come around sooner than you'd think. He didn't put a date on that, but that is some good news that it's going to be coming around sooner than you'd think. And then they said in anticipation of that, they are broadening their Twitch streaming. Right now, I think they just do it once a week or something, where it's focused on Warhammer content. They're going to be splitting up into kind of more streams so that they can support both historical and fantasy, so Warhammer and historical stuff, in parallel on the streams, kind of tag on and off between them. So that leads me to believe that they're going to make this announcement hopefully in the next couple months, presumably this year. So that's cool. But then they ask a couple more questions. So what time period is it going to be? And that's the big question for everyone. And so Darren has a quote in response. He says, quote, "It's not an era that's been covered before." So we knew that previously, but he reaffirms that this is not going to be a sequel to anything that's been done previously. So that's kind of interesting. And then he also notes that there's a striking art style that they're excited to share with everyone. So yeah, there's that. So next big historical title, he says, hey, it's not going to take place in a similar era to what we've done before. So what I just decided to do for some speculation is I made a big timeline stretching from the 6th century BC to the 20th century in the Common Era, and laid out all the Total War titles with their add-ons, so you can see them here. And what I wanted to do this for was, hey, let's get an idea of where CA has been before and kind of what they're thinking of expanding. So we're going to discuss, using this timeline, two things. The first is going to be well, obviously the next historical title, but then also the second is going to be CA's idea of this Black Ops team, I should say. That's, I believe, being led by Jack Lusted, or he's playing a key role. And basically what this team does is they're exploring the potential to do a standalone title. So it's not going to be like, or sorry, not a standalone title. It's going to be a kind of a smaller version of a historical content thing that could be the form of like a DLC for a previous title. So it could be something like an Age of Charlemagne that they would go back and revisit. So let's tackle that first. So looking at the timeline here, what could they potentially do? Well, there's a couple topics that I think they could cover. They did mention that if they're going to go down this route, presumably it's going to be built off one of the previous two games or the recent games. So obviously that has to be, built off of Rome or built off of Attila. Now, Attila comes after Rome, so if they're going to do something that's kind of an add-on to those, an add-on to Rome would go into Attila territory, so that doesn't make any sense. So if they're going to build it off of the Rome game, then it would have to go, to something before Rome. Similarly, if you're doing something about Attila, you couldn't really do before because then you're encroaching on Rome territory, so Attila would go into the future. So that's kind of how I see it. Now, so let's presume they're going to go and build off of Rome. What could they do? Well, going a little bit earlier in Roman history, I would say they would probably cover the Greco-Persian Wars, because that's interesting. It has Sparta, the 300, Thermopylae, and all that. That sells well. It's relatively interesting. But the scope is kind of small, and I don't see them bringing anything super new to the table, so I'm not super keen on the Greco-Persian Wars. Although what I do see them doing is a little bit after that, Alexander and the successor kings. That could be more interesting. Well, Alexander is a big Hollywood seller, super interesting. You have a lot of conflict. That would be a very interesting, it could even be a very focused campaign. Now, Alexander could be something where they just do Alexander, similar to the way the Rome 1 expansion, Alexander focused on his campaigns and just took place over a couple of years. This new standalone title or this new add-on could potentially do the same thing, but I would imagine they would try and do not only Alexander, but presumably cover the successor king. So go into Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antiochus, and things like that. I think that's how they would pitch it, and that allows them to expand the scope and do the eastern half of the Roman campaign map, which would be pretty cool. Some new stuff, lots of new dynamics, and yeah, I think this would be a good period to cover. That's if they decide to stay within the scope of kind of the Mediterranean basin, though. If they decide to do something else, well, around the same time period, you go over to China, and there's the Warring States period. Around the end of this, there was about 7 warring states fighting for control of kind of central China. That could be potentially interesting. I don't necessarily see CA going after this because it's kind of risky in that it doesn't have that much name recognition. People aren't that excited. And so what I presume they're going to do is, hey, if we're going to do an add-on, it's going to tack on to something similar and make it an easier sell. So if they go for Rome, I presumably imagine it's going to be Greco-Persian Wars or Alexander and the Successor Kings. Again, leave comments below to let me know what you think, but that's my that would be what I would bet on. If we go over to Attila, if they're going to build off of this, what could they do? Well, they did the last Roman, which is kind of Justinian's campaigns, and then they did the Age of Charlemagne. What they could also do, I imagine, would be the rise of Islam, the Muslim conquests. You could talk about the Rashidun Caliphs, 632-61, or 660 to 750, the Umayyad Caliphate. That would be really interesting. A different twist from the Eurocentric focus we've seen previously. That would be a lot of attention, and then obviously this would be kind of similar territory we've seen before, but rapid expansion. And you could even have something interesting where Rise of Islam kind of comes and butts heads with the Age of Charlemagne, where you have later down the road, the Caliph of Cordoba fighting, and pushing up into Europe. So I see Rise of Islam as a very potential topic to cover. And then another thing after this that kind of comes a little bit after the Age of Charlemagne that they would presumably cover would be the Age of Vikings. Kind of late 8th century to the early 11th century. This is something they did as an expansion for Medieval 1, but I definitely see them pursuing this. There's the obviously appeal of it in terms of how do you sell it. There's the TV show Vikings that people are excited about. So I see Age of Vikings as a pretty safe bet. It'll give people their medieval fix that they've wanted to see again. That got people really excited when they played Age of Charlemagne. They really liked that. That one had good acclaim, and so I see Age of Vikings being kind of a nod to the success of Age of Charlemagne, building off of it and kind of tuning into the Viking period, which has popular recognition and would be an easy sell, like I've said. So that's kind of how I see that playing out. They could do another title that maybe goes a little bit later or earlier, that again tries to focus on China. So if you go a little bit earlier, around the 3rd century, you could get the Three Kingdoms period of China. Again, same conclusion about the Warring States period. As a standalone title, I don't see it being super exciting for CA. Potentially as a standalone for the next big historical title, yeah, maybe. But as a single side action piece, I don't see it gaining that much traction. But potentially Three Kingdoms is something they could cover. What they could also maybe do is build off the Attila engine, just like Age of Charlemagne starts to dabble in medieval history. They can maybe even push the timeline a little bit further and do maybe the 100 Years' War period. Agincourt has a lot of popularity and things like that. Seeing knights charging would definitely be exciting for people. So that's kind of my speculation for the standalone Black Ops title, presumably. Let's turn our attention to the main historical title, the one that Devin was talking about. And this is the one that he says has, quote, a striking art style that they want to share and they're excited to share. So what do I think they could cover? Well, they've said it's going to be a period that they haven't covered before. So where does that put us? Well, CA has covered a lot of the time period from the Romans, up into Attila, transitioning into Age of Charlemagne, and then medieval. So that's a pretty big span that covers 5th to 14th century about. But it's very Eurocentric. And so what I think CA is going to do is they're going to change their focus. Where are they going to put it? Honestly, I see a couple of things. I see them shifting their gaze to the east, and so presumably where I see them going, and what I think is most likely, is Mongols. The reason I think they're going to go with Mongols is because they're super well recognized. That would sell very well. And also the scope of the Mongol period, 13th, 14th century, has a lot of different stuff in it. I mean, the Mongols were fighting samurai at the same time, on the east, at the same time that they were fighting European knights to the west. So if they do a Mongol time period, this would allow them to cover not only a big time frame of history, but also slice across a lot of different cultures. This would play into their striking art style that they're talking about, very stylized, I could see, kind of similar to how they did the Shogun 2 art style. I could see them applying that to the Mongol history. Mongol history would be huge armies, lots of stuff, would be really cool, and it's going to be one of the biggest maps that we've seen. So this would kind of, previously I would say that would be a problem, but with what they're doing and what they're announcing with Warhammer 1 and 2 and having a huge campaign map, I think those are forging the way for potentially a Mongol period where you would have conquests in the east against China, Japan, and then in the west. One of the cool things about the Mongols, again, like I've said, is it kind of encapsulates a lot of different cultures. So you would be able to bring back a little bit of Japanese history, even the Koreans and stuff like that. You could also bring in, obviously, China, something that CA has never touched before. So the Mongol wars against China are huge, vastly important conflicts. And so, boom, you have a chance to bring in China. But then also to the west, you have them fighting against the Arabs. So all of a sudden, now you get to bring back the Middle East, their relevance, the Khwarezmians and things like that. And then also, of course, you get your classical knights. You get around kind of this time period, the Crusades. And so you have a whole breadth of people. And this is the only really way I can see them competing with the asymmetry that Warhammer has brought about. Warhammer brought about a bunch of different factions with varied fighting styles, and the only thing comparable really in history, I think, would be the Mongol time period because of how far it spreads across the world. So my bet is on Mongols. Now, if they don't do that, well, they could push it a little bit further ahead in time, I believe. 15th, 16th, 17th century, I should say. Renaissance period. I presume if they go down this route, it would be kind of similar to the Americas campaign, where you'd have Age of Exploration. This could be kind of interesting, but again, this is a bit Eurocentric, so I don't necessarily see them doing it. If they do, I mean, it's going to get a lot of attention. It would be great, but I think it's a little bit too similar to what we've seen previously. Another one that they could potentially do if they want to go even further, kind of piggybacking off the Napoleonic period, pushing it maybe a little bit further, would be something presumably called Victoria or the Industrial Revolution, something like that. Something that would get you into a little bit closer to modern times. Think follow the samurai type technology, and maybe even pushing this up to the Franco-Prussian War and really the cusp of World War I. This would be very interesting stuff. Although I think there's so much content in this that it would be kind of too hard to do. Just like CA was stretched too far with Empire, Victoria makes it even harder because you're covering so many different. I mean, you're global at that point, and so I see CA getting a little bit in trouble once they go down that route. But again, presumably they could cover a bunch of different sections of the map, kind of like they did with Empire with different regions, or presumably they could focus on Victoria era in one region, and then the next historical title could open that up, kind of similar to what Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 are doing. So Victoria could be possible, but yeah, I don't see it too much. I mean, besides that, the Americas have been pretty much kind of exempt from CA coverage. They did a little bit with the Medieval Tool campaign of the Americas, and they did it a little bit with Empire with the United States War of Independence. But that's kind of it. I mean, previously, yes, they could do, there's a lot of history to cover. The Mayas, the Incas, you could do all, Central American history, Southern American history, a little bit of, Northern American history, but necessarily, I don't want to say it's stagnant, but it doesn't have the scope and the scale of a traditional Total War title. So pretty much, I think the Americas are locked off until you get the Age of Exploration. So that's why I don't see it as being a major title. Besides that, you could do something in Africa, although mostly Northern Africa, around the Mediterranean is where you see a lot more of the fighting, but that gets us back to, Eurocentric and something we've covered. So in terms of African history, I don't see them covering too much. The really big unopened one, I would think, would be, as I've mentioned, China. Mongols bridges all of that, so that would be a big bet. But if you want to go earlier in Chinese history, yeah, maybe they could do that. And even far back in early history, what they could maybe even do is an Age of Bronze title. But I don't see that having really the popular appeal that people would be excited for. So, conclusion of all this, my bet is going to be the Mongols. I don't think they'll make the Mongols the crux of it, but I think they'll be able to pitch, imagine a trailer, samurai, knights, Arabs all fighting together. It's almost, it's almost the same trailer as Total War Warhammer with all these asymmetrical factions, but with the history, realism to it. So that's why my bet is on the Mongols. Anyways, I've rambled on enough. This has been a bit too much speculation, but I think I've kind of built a case for why I think Mongols is going to be the main standalone title, and if they do pursue something that's going to be kind of it's the Black Ops team, the smaller package, I think presumably they'll do Rise of Islam or Age of Vikings. The reason for doing that is because it's built off the latest title of Attila. It covers new kind of time periods. It would grab popular attention, and it would kind of feed nicely into the Mongols, especially if you do the Rise of Islam. Well, the Mongols pretty much gave them a spanking, and so Rise of Islam would feed nicely into the Mongols. So yeah, that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned for more, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.